Hello, YouTube audience. I already have in my ear the Twitter audience, so thank you for joining me. I'm going to do my official hellos in just a moment, as soon as I have my recording equipment turned on. Thank you for joining me. I am the Shaggy Dog Philosopher. This is another episode, the third episode of Shaggy Dog Chew Toys, wherein I read things I don't like. Well, I just read things that I like to chew my mind on. And we're going to continue with part 3 of Jane Roberts' The Afterdeath Journal of an American Philosopher. But in keeping with our themes and what I want to be doing with this project, and because there's nobody here in the live with me, I'll talk to the future about what this project is, because this is a public education performance. I'm not here to teach you anything, but I am here to show you how I think, and I am here to show you the things that intellectual people use to spend their what's called leisure time, their free time on, and what modern intellectuals don't want specifically you thinking about today. Because if you think about these things too closely, you'll notice that they're all Nazi bullshit. So, welcome to the live. We've got right into it. I have cursed too early in the video. And so where we're going to begin is because last time I talked about, you probably can't even hear me, because last time I talked about some very specific books. I talked about Aleister Crowley's Book of Lies, and I talked about, I talked about Teresa of Avila's The Interior Castle. And so what I'm going to do is, in keeping with tradition, I'm going to, rather than begin at Jane Roberts, I'm going to begin at some supplemental material that I want you to be thinking about whether it is or is not similar to what we're reading with Jane Roberts. We can't know what she's read, but if we can recognize the things that she's talking about and other things that predated her, we can presuppose that she's read them, and we can begin to tear apart her psychopathology. We can start to pick apart her brain and kind of understand her in a meaningful and deliberate kind of way. So for the YouTube audience, let me double check that I'm audible. It seems that I'm audible on Twitter. And we're gonna jump right into these. The longer I do these, the more of these you've seen, the shorter my introductions can be, and the more I can just say, hey, it's me, I'm doing this, let's get at it. Here's what I've got in store for you today. And I do plan to have supplemental material, even if we're just reading concurrent, 2 books simultaneously. I do want you thinking about more than just what Jane is saying and more than about just what I'm saying, because what I'm saying is largely unimportant. I'm not here to sell you a product. I'm here to sell you me, which is kind of a product, but this is a brand, is not a product. And I am working for tips. So we're going to begin at Aleister Crowley's The Book of Lies. And we're just going to start right in the beginning, because I want you to see what this new age, what the material that was coming out of the 20th century and that Jane Roberts may or may not be aping is actually like. Because when I picked up Aleister Crowley, I thought I was going to be reading something interesting. And what I was reading was decidedly uninteresting to me. So we're going to read it. It begins, "Oh, the anti-primal triad, which is not God. Nothing is, nothing becomes, nothing is not. The first triad, which is God, I am. I utter the word. I hear the word. The abyss. The word is broken up. There is knowledge. Knowledge is relation. These fragments are creation. The broken manifests light. The second triad, which is God. God the Father and Mother, is concealed in generation. God is concealed in the whirling energy of nature. God is manifest in gathering, harmony, consideration, the mirror of the sun and of the heart." And now, because I need to interrupt frequently in the interest of fair use, I'm not reading this as a performance of how good I am at reading. I'm reading this as a performance of how good I am at intellectual criticism, literary criticism, etc. And I just want to be very clear to you that in episode 1, I told you that Andrea Perrin and Jane Roberts in general call God of the Christian and, well, broader Abrahamic faith, they call that God capital N nature, and it's because Crowley did, and uh, it's because Madame Blavatsky did, and it's right here. I can prove it. God is concealed in the whirling energy of nature. The third triad: bearing, preparing, wavering, flowing, flashing, stability, begetting. This doesn't mean anything. It's also every one of those words is separated by a colon, and it doesn't mean anything. He's trying to do a mathematical proof, but you have to remember this is channeled, and that's why I'm reading it to you. The Book of Lies, as I told you last episode, was channeled from a god into Aleister Crowley's mind. The 10th emanation, the world. It's just nonsense. And then we move to the second poem. The Sabbath of the Goat. Oh, the heart of Nox, the night of Pan. Pi Alpha Nu, duality, energy, death. Death, begetting, the supporters of O. To beget is to die is to beget. Cast the seed into the field of night. Life and death are two names of A, that is the letter A. Kill thyself. Neither of these alone is enough. It's just nonsense. It's metamystical nonsense. And don't take it literally. So what happens in your brain when you read anything is that you take it literally. That's where the word literal comes from. It means that you read it and you believed it as truth. And so to hear any word literally means to hear it and then take it as truth. And that truth is capital T truth. It means aletheia, and it means divine knowledge from God. I was just in a group chat about this where a friend of mine, I love him dearly, but he's a college grad, and so he doesn't understand anything about anything. And he didn't understand that, fundamentally that. The cry of the hawk. Hur hath a secret fourfold name. It is do what thou wilt. 4 words, not one, many, all hyphenated. Thou child, hyphenated. Thy name is holy. Thy kingdom is come. Thy will is done. Here is the bread. Here is the blood. Bring us through temptation. Deliver us from good and evil. That mine is thine be the crown of the kingdom, even now. Abrahadabra. These 10 words are for the name of the one. This is blasphemy, is all it is. But it's in a book titled The Book of Lies that in the Kindle version is all page 80 of 80. So it's just nonsense. It's just performative, anti-spiritual, ODD, meaning oppositional defiant disorder nonsense. Aleister Crowley was a rich person who hated that he was rich and had responsibilities, and so he invented a religion to tell you that he didn't actually have responsibilities via. And so now I want to show you the opposite. That's a book filled with lies. I would like to now show you a book filled with truth. An actual lived mystical experience by an actual medieval mystic. One of the things that Aleister Crowley was decidedly not was an actual mystic. He wasn't actually mystical. He may have been using drugs and he may have been going into trance states, but what he was doing was liberally stealing from Asia and then inventing things as it was appropriate to him based on secret knowledge that you're not allowed access to and that I can't prove exists because I don't have ancient and Templar libraries. Because if they existed in the 19th century, they don't exist in the same manner in the 21st century. So we're going to pivot from Aleister Crowley and broad blaspheme to Teresa of Avila, who I also spoke of yesterday. In fact, I talked to you about Teresa Avila's interior castle, and I believe I named it. Wrong, titled it wrong, but I got Teresa of Avila right, and for me, that's the greater accomplishment. I'm not going to preface for you what Teresa of Avila's interior castle is because I did yesterday. You can watch these out of order if you like. You can watch them in order if you like. You do you. So I'm just going to read Teresa of Avila was a mystic. She was a Christian, and she lived in the Middle Ages. I think she was in the 1300s. I'm probably wrong about that, but that is unimportant because we're trying to move this thing along. Chapter 1. This chapter treats of the beauty and dignity of our souls and makes a comparison to explain this. The advantage of knowing and understanding this and the favors God grants to us is shown and how prayer is the gate of the spiritual castle. 1. Plan of this book. 2. Interior castle. 3. Our curable self-ignorance. 4. God dwells in the center of the soul. 5. Why all souls do not receive certain favors. 6. Reasons for speaking of these favors. 7. The entrance of the castle. 8. Entering into oneself. 9. Prayer. 10. Those who dwell in the first mansion. 11. Entering. 12. Difficulties of the subject. And here I'm going to break in, and not because of literary critical reasons, but in fact to give you a little bit of context. This book was very widely read. In fact, Jung and to a lesser extent Freud were deliberately ripping her off, whether they knew it or not. Jung knew it. Definitely Jung knew what he was doing. 1. Begging our Lord today to speak for me, since I know not what to say, nor how to commence this work which obedience has laid upon me, an idea occurred to me which I will explain, and which will serve as a foundation for that I am about to write, says Miss Avila. 2. I thought of the soul as resembling a castle, formed of a single diamond or a very transparent crystal, and containing many rooms, just as in heaven there are many mansions. If we reflect, sisters, we shall see that the soul of the just man is but a paradise, in which God tells us he takes his delight. What, do you imagine, must that dwelling be, in which a king so mighty, so wise, and so pure, containing in himself and all good, can delight to rest? Nothing can be compared to the great beauty and capabilities of a soul. However keen our intellects may be, they are as unable to comprehend them as to comprehend God, for, as he has told us, he created us in his own image and likeness. As this is so, we need not tire ourselves by trying to realize all the beauty of this castle. Although, being his creature, there is all the difference between the soul and God that there is between the creature and the creator. The fact that it is made in God's image teaches us how great are its dignity and loveliness. It is no small misfortune and disgrace that, through our own fault, we neither understand our nature nor our origin. Would it not be gross ignorance, my daughters, if, when a man was questioned about his name or country or parents, he could not answer? Stupid as this would be, it is unspeakably more foolish to care to learn nothing of our nature except that we possess bodies, and only to realize vaguely that we have souls, because people say so, and it is a doctrine of faith. Rarely do we reflect upon what gifts our souls may possess, who dwells within them, or how extremely precious they are. Therefore, we do little to preserve their beauty. All our care is concentrated on our bodies, which are but the coarse setting of the diamond or the outer walls of the castle. That's highlighted in my Kindle version, which means that enough people have highlighted that independently that Kindle said, hey, this is a famous passage. 4. Let us imagine, as I said, that there are many rooms in this castle, of which some are above, some below, others at the side. In the center, in the very midst of them all, is this principal chamber in which God and the soul hold their most secret intercourse. Think over this comparison very carefully. God granted it. God grant it may enlighten you about the different kinds of graces he is pleased to bestow upon the soul. No one can know all about them, much less a person so ignorant as I am. The knowledge that such things are possible will console you greatly should our Lord ever grant you any of these favors. People themselves deprived of them can then at least praise him for his great goodness in bestowing them on others. The thought of heaven and the happiness of the saints does us no harm, but cheers and urges us to win with joy for ourselves, nor will it injure us to know that during this exile God can communicate himself to us, loathsome worms. It will rather make us love him for such immense goodness and infinite mercy. 5. I feel sure that vexation at thinking that during our life on earth God can bestow these graces on the souls of others shows a want of humility and charity for one's neighbor. For why should we not feel glad at a brother's receiving divine favors which do not deprive us of our own share? Should we not rather rejoice at his majesty's thus manifesting his greatness wherever he chooses? Sometimes our Lord acts thus solely for the sake of showing his power, as he declared when the apostles questioned whether the blind man whom he cured had been suffered for his own or his parents' sins. God does not bestow these favors on certain souls because they are more holy than others who do not receive them, but to manifest his greatness, as in the case of St. Paul and St. Mary Magdalene, and that we may glorify him in his creatures. Does this sound anything at all like what Jane Roberts has written to you? If you're picking up after having read the first two, does this sound anything at all like what Roberts has written of her own worldview, of her own mystical experience, of her own sort of revulsion filled reverence for nature? This doesn't sound these don't sound the same at all. I've already told you that there's a melancholy. There's an absolute melancholy and distaste in everything that Jane Roberts writes. There's a passive aggressive sarcasm every time she has uh, William James use scare quotes and in his anachronisms. She hates our world. Hate is the word. Hate is the emotion that she feels. Does Teresa of Avila sound like she hates us? 6. People may say such things appear impossible, and it is best not to scandalize the weak in faith by speaking about them. But it is better that the latter should disbelieve us than that we should desist from enlightening souls which receive these graces, that they may rejoice and may endeavor to love God better for his favors, seeing he is so mighty and so great. There is no danger here of shocking those for whom I write by treating of such matters, for they know and believe that God gives even greater proofs of his love. I am certain that if any one of you doubts the truth of this, God will never allow her to learn it by experience, for he desires that no limit should be set to his work. Therefore, never discredit them, because you are not thus led yourselves. Now, this book is written for initiates into a female mystical cult. And that's not irrelevant because the book we're about to move to, I'm not going to read all of this introduction to you. That's what I wanted you to hear. I wanted you to hear that in Teresa Avila's life, what Jane Roberts is doing marks her as uninitiated. It marks her as inexperienced and it marks her as unintelligent. It marks her as someone that needs to be burned, her work, maybe even her very body. Okay, so we're gonna pop off of her at 6, and if you like any of these books that I'm reading as context and you want to hear more from these books, let me know in the comments. Let me know on Patreon. Let me know on Twitter. I'm Shaggy Dog. I think it's Shaggy Philosopher. Actually, is what my handle is on Twitter. Let me see if I can crash this page by opening Twitter. I keep saying I'm not going to do that. I also keep saying that I'm not going to tuck my antlers behind my ear like they're overlong hair. But now that my hair has gotten overlong again on me, I spent the bulk of my time growing out my hair not putting it in a hair tie because I've worn my hair long since 1998, and I used to justify it with my mother who hated it. My mother absolutely hated it, but I used to justify it by keeping it in a permanent ponytail. So she couldn't say that I wasn't at least taking care of it. Shaggy Philosopher. That's philosophy without the Y, and that's it's a sort of passive aggressive. I hope I hope that my minimizing didn't turn that off. But the Shaggy Philosopher is a kind of passive aggressive jab at the 19th century German philosophy tradition in general. So if you don't like that I call myself a philosopher, know that I don't either. I don't like calling myself a philosopher. But now we're going to move to another book I haven't finished because I want you to see what it looks like when I read a book anymore. But I also want to read this book to you. This book, I should have looked. I should be I should be doing a better job at giving you biographical details of these books, bibliographical details of these books, and biographical details of their authors. But that's not what this is about. You you are capable of all of these things, and I don't say that in condescension. A lot of the reason you don't Google things on your own is because you don't know that you know how to parse through the information and find what you need. And you've been told so many times by so many condescending dickheads that Wikipedia isn't a valid source. Look at me. Look right here in my eyes. Wikipedia is a good enough source for you. You're not writing a scholarly paper. Okay. Now that I've bullied you, the book I want to read for you is called Ghosts in the Middle Ages, and we're not going to read this whole book. We're not going to sit for 20 hours for context, just for flavor. Flavor before we get into something that I really don't like. Okay, this book was written by Jean-Claude Schmitt. I highly recommend you buy it. I highly recommend you read it. I highly recommend that if he's still alive, you write him fan letters. This book was originally published, I believe, in 1984. No, this book was originally published in 1994. So you run into a chance. You run a risk, and we're gonna be honest with ourselves right now. We're gonna be honest with ourselves. We're gonna be honest with the future. I think I'm still talking to myself. I don't think I have anybody in Twitter. We're gonna be honest, and we're gonna address something forthrightly that nobody really wants to ever talk about, and that's that between the beginning of time and 2008, historians were not private people. They were public employees of a government, or they were private employees of private citizens. And so what that means is that history until the market crash of 2008 is propaganda. When you read it, you can read history, you can read fact out of it. It's there to be found. I'm not sure I've got audio here. Do I have? I don't think I have audio on the live stream. I think I'm going to have to start this over because my Audacity also crashed. So I don't have the podcast. Oh, that's so annoying. What happened? Yeah, I think my microphone. Okay, so I don't know what happened. I lost audio. A bunch of my stuff crashed. This is seriously a bummer. Okay, well, I'm just going to push through it because I've got the Audacity back on, and those first two readings were less important to me than what I'm going to do. So anyway, I'm going to, for the Spotify and Patreon audience, I'm sorry that you missed the first part of the show. If any of the audio recorded, it'll be on the YouTube and on the Patreon versions. These are the kinds of hiccups I'm just going to have to deal with because I'm very poor. My equipment is very not good. So I apologize for that, everyone that gets to hear me deal with that in the middle of the recorded version that I'm not going to cut out. If you want me to cut it out, pay me. Pay me, ask me for cut up versions, and that can happen. So everything before 2008, I was trying to tell you, everything before 2008 from a history perspective is propaganda. And what happened in 2008 is that the reason the market crash happened was about emptying the public coffers. It was about taking money out of the middle class so the middle class could no longer go to places like state parks and public history museums. places like the Creation Museum, places like Smithsonian, places like, I think his name is Tom Wolfe, the Tom Wolfe Society in Asheville, North Carolina, Civil War museums. The goal behind the 2008 market crash was to bankrupt all of your public history organizations. And so what happened is that public historians, the good ones, the smart ones, let's say 95% of them just hit the bottle and became depressed, and the ones who could still live in bed, and the ones who couldn't are sugar babies. But they were never very far from prostitutes to begin with. They were literary and intellectual prostitutes. And so a lot of what I'm doing here is a sort of public demonstration of what literary and intellectual prostitution looks like and what it does to the person who participates in it, to everyone who participates in it, me, you, everyone, from the bottom level up. And feeling like you have some control over my output is what politicians feel like when they have control over a particular public historian's output, for example. And so this book, what I'm trying to tell you is that this book, because it's about ghosts and because it's not about the culture war, this book is going to be largely unchanged by the historians going public in 2008 to tell you that everything's butt fucked. And I'm allowed to say that now. But this book is not part of the culture war. So this book's not going to tell you that everything is butt fucked. This book is still trying to answer questions from a scholastic perspective in the pre-2008, not engaging, deliberately not engaging in the culture war, because in 1994, the culture war hadn't really gotten ramped up yet. That book was written in 92 or later, and we'll visit it too. I don't have a hard or I don't have a Kindle copy. I was trying to listen. I was trying to use that book is called The Great Degeneration, and I was trying to listen to it to just chill out and do macrame behind what's behind me, and that didn't happen. So from Ghosts of the Middle Ages, we're going to read. I would like to read the entire introduction, and I would like you to see what my copy looks like, what copies of books have begun to look like for me. But we may not do all of it, and my antlers may get on my nerves enough that I take the hat off. I'm feeling ADHD and claustrophobic today. Introduction. The dead have no existence other than that which the living imagines for them. In different ways, depending on their culture, their beliefs, and the time in which they lived, people have attributed the dead with a life in the hereafter. They have depicted the places where the dead reside, and in this way, they have imagined the fate that they hope or fear for themselves. Accordingly, imagining death and the future of the dead and the hereafter has formed an essential part of the religious beliefs of all societies. So far, so good. Such imaginings have assumed various but widely recognized forms, among which visions and dreams have always been of primary importance. Now, he footnotes that, and I'm not going to look up the footnotes because he doesn't have his footnotes on the bottom page. He has his footnotes in the back of the book, and that's a pain in the ass. But if what we're doing is experiencing Jane Roberts as she experiences a dream in a semi-conscious state, that sentence is very important for us to remember. Such imaginings have assumed various but widely recognized forms, among which visions and dreams have always been of primary importance. In some regions, the ability of certain people, such as the Siberian shamans, to travel to the hereafter in their dreams or in a state of trance has been fully accepted. Elsewhere, exceptional figures, such as Christ or following in his footsteps, the saints of Christianity, were believed to have had the power to bring the dead back to life. And everywhere we can find what is usually called a belief in ghosts. Apparitions of ghosts represented a reverse movement between the dead and the living in the travels of the hereafter. In the rich literature of visions and voyages into the hereafter, from Book 6 of Virgil's Aeneid to the Divine Comedy of Dante, including St. Patrick's Purgatory, visionaries encountered the souls of the dead whom they themselves had once known on earth, or whose names and renown had come to their attention. But the goal of such revelations was not, as a general rule, to account for the fate of a specific dead person in the hereafter, with the exception of certain rulers and highly political visions. Rather, the goal was to reveal to the living, to listeners or readers of the Visio, the geography of the places of the hereafter. The steep paths, the frozen rivers, the furnaces, and the list of tortures beyond the grave throughout the centuries, the great reservoirs of the Western imagination. And I want to remind you that we talked about the harrowing of hell a little bit yesterday when we talked about Jesus. And this is what he's talking about: is every great political figure since political figure since Gilgamesh has gone into hell and come out to tell the literary tradition what hell is like. And so what that means is that in addition to that, all of the ancientest style civilizations or societies or ways of life that we can find, all the ones that are so-called shamanic, that's a term of that's actually a bad word to use. But those people were all doing the same things. They were sending specific representatives into death to tell us what death is like. And so there's a belief among the Madame Blavatsky types, the Jane Roberts types, that that's what Jesus was, right? I told you, we talked about that yesterday. Yet the structure and function of ghost tales differ greatly. In such tales, it was not the living who traveled to the beyond, but the dead who appeared to the living. Nor was it the manifestation of a dead person completely comparable to the apparitions of other supernatural beings. And now I want you to see what my book looks like. My copy looks like this. I've highlighted passages and then things that I've felt relevant to argue with myself, or with the book itself, or things that I think I need to remember or that I'm thinking about, rather than think about them and forget them and just and read paragraph after paragraph of things that I'm not paying attention to. I write down my thoughts and then I go back to reading. So what I'm doing to you into this microphone is very, very much how I study on my own. This is just so other people will eventually see it. So much of my work never gets seen because until very recently it was for me. It was only for me. Now I'm trying to do it for a paycheck. So hook a brother up. Ask for my Cash App. Such as angels and demons, or even Christ, the Virgin, and the saints, these latter beings usually resided in the hereafter, where they remained invisible except when they occasionally appeared before living men and women. Ghosts, on the other hand, still had one foot on the ground, so to speak. They had just departed from the living, to whom they later appeared, and from whom they seemed not to be able to separate themselves. With tales of apparitions of Christ, the Virgin, or the devil, the historian is immediately plunged into all the wealth of the imaginary of Christian societies. But with tales of ghosts, the historian is also immediately confronted with the complexities of the the social relationships that existed between the living and the dead, who returned again to visit those living. Thus, unlike the great visions of the hereafter, ghost tales concentrated on the status of the deceased, who was an ordinary person. Granted, saints also appeared, and they too were dead. Their apparitions and the dreams and visions of the living were a favorite theme in hagiography, but saints, according to the very accurate expression of Peter Brown, were very special dead people who pose specific problems. I will speak of them only parenthetically, emphasizing instead the apparitions of the ordinary dead of everyday ghosts. Ever since the Romantic period, as conveyed in literature and horror films, as well as in contemporary comic strips, ghosts have been a part of the required scenery of the Middle Ages as we have been content to imagine it, a Middle Ages of haunted castles, dragons, phantoms, and even vampires. Not everything was fantasy, and this, nevertheless, too facile image. In a highly religious culture, in the sense that everyone accepted the existence and the power of supernatural beings who were generally invisible but always nearby, a culture that was comfortable with death and the dead, a belief in ghosts, was accepted by all. Let us not, however, conclude that the dead were omnipresent in the concerns and the dreams of the living, or that the living expected to see their ancestors rise up before them whenever they turned around. Not every dead person returned, and the dead did not appear to just anyone, anytime, anywhere. These are all none of this needs me to break in, but I have to. I should. I should, because I'm reading this to publish it under his name as an audiobook. In medieval society, as in many other traditional societies, the specific type of existence attributed to the deceased depended on how the rite of passage of death had occurred. The dead generally returned when the funeral and mourning rituals could not be performed in the prescribed way. For example, if the body of a drowning victim disappeared and could not be buried according to custom, or if a murder victim, a suicide, a woman who died during childbirth, or a stillborn baby presented the members of the community of the living with the danger of a blemish on their group. Such subjects were generally deemed unlucky. This anthropological and widespread dimension of the return of the dead can be found among other places in Western traditions from antiquity to the Middle Ages, and even in contemporary folklore. Nevertheless, I believe that the historian of the Middle Ages must broaden the more general anthropological definition of ghosts using more specific historical considerations. Some of these specific factors are the result of the complex makeup of medieval culture, of the weight of the heritage that gave birth to it, the legacies of Greco-Roman paganism, in which the cult of the dead of the polis or the people played a very important role, or the barbarian legacies that were brought back through the migrations of Germanic peoples and that were integrated into Christendom during the first millennium. In this regard, Claude Lecouteux, I believe that's how you pronounce that, is to be congratulated for having emphasized the debt that the ecclesiastical and Latin literature of the Middle Ages owed to Germanic traditions. He has shown how the Christian duo of the soul, immaterial and eternal, and the body, material and perishable, has sometimes served only to superficially mask the Germanic pagan concept of a quasi physical double, Hammer, that survives after death. Now is a good time for me to break in and tell you that when I seem to be psychopathological about an obsession with neo paganism, their rights, and how they're trying to mind fuck you, I didn't get it from nowhere, and I most certainly didn't come uh, out of this book with it, because I've only read to page 19 of this book, and you can tell when I stopped. I mean, you can very clearly tell when I stopped. Um, and uh, more importantly, I I I came to this book with these ideas that I already had. I've only been reading this book for a few months, and I don't read it every day, obviously. 19 pages is like maybe 2 or 3 sit down and reads at the depth that I do, maybe 5 or 6. Um, I don't think that our author was obsessed with the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s. I think our author is just and only correct. And I think he's established that already in this introduction. According to Lecouteux, many Latin tales that describe ghosts as being endowed with corporeity were derived from such concepts, which can be found in the Edda and in certain Scandinavian sagas first written in the 12th and 13th centuries. And that's another thing, is when you hear me talk about neo-Vikings, and I've read the Eddas, I've read the sagas, most. I don't I don't know which ones I haven't. I haven't read Vinland yet, but I've read the Eddas, the poetic and the prose, and I've read many of the sagas, and I've read so many books about them, that this author's right. He's right. And when I talk about this neo Viking, internet Viking age thing, I'm not blowing smoke. People have been saying it for 30 years. 1994 is 30 years ago. Like the many studies on the folkloric culture of the Middle Ages, this approach might indeed lead to a richer understanding of the various levels of meaning hidden within the medieval document. I will, however, hazard another interpretation of medieval ghosts. Although legacies and consequently an archaeology of medieval texts must not be ignored, I intend rather to show how beliefs and the imaginary depend above all on the structures and the functioning of the society and the culture at a given period in time. Mentalities consist not only of the ancient layers that survive from earlier thoughts and behaviors, but also of the beliefs and the images, the words and the gestures that fully find their meaning in the contemporary social relations and ideology of a given age. And if here I'm doing a brief sequel to my conversation with the J. Nicholas on Twitter, follow him, about Nietzsche from a couple of weeks ago. What we're talking about here and what the author is deliberately doing right here is separating himself from Nazi bullshit. He could have used the word Gestalt, and I would have immediately thrown this book in the trash. It is by considering this reality that we will understand how the Christian culture of the Middle Ages enlarged the notion of ghosts and created other opportunities for the dead to appear. The period of my focus, from the 5th to the 15th centuries, with particular emphasis on the Central Middle Ages, experienced the succession and the combination of traditional beliefs and of the slowly Christianized rituals of tame death, according to the term used by Philip Arias. I believe that's how you pronounce that. Of the torment of the death of the self, the individual fear of the moment of passing, and the specific judgment that leads the soul toward one of the three principal locations in the Christian hereafter, hell, purgatory, or paradise, and even of the pain of the death of the other, the concern about the fate of relatives and deceased friends in the hereafter. Well before mourning was raised to a more secularized form in the weeping statuary in the centuries of 19th century bourgeois Europe. And I want to stop here and remind you that I have told you both of these things. All of this stuff that he's writing here, I've told you independently of thinking about it being in this book. I've told you in the first two parts to this. Specifically, what I want to tell you now is that this hyper modern pathologization of the fact that we will die in people like why won't Alan Watts, and people like Alan Watts telling you that it's always been the human being's gift to know that eventually someday he will die is untrue. It's untrue. The only people who pathologized that they were going to die someday were the very, very, very highest elites of society. It only became a pathologization in the Middle Ages when you had to be Christian in order to get an afterlife. And he may or may not talk about that as we continue. And I may or may not read this entire introduction because I am approaching my first hour and I do want to read Jane Roberts for you. I do not want to read Jane Roberts. In this complex network of attitudes, some quite ancient, others new, medieval society envisioned the possibility that certain of the deceased could return and visit the living, or at least those among the living with whom they had formed ties considered unalterable even beyond death. At the same time, important transformations in social structures led to the redefinition of the individual's position within groups and communities that remained in place well after the passing of an individual member. Kinship groups, both natural and spiritual, as well as monastery communities and communities of noble lineage, of the parish, and of confraternities, a confraternity is a secret society, formed the framework for these new relationships not only between the living but also between the living and the dead. A confraternity can also be called a cult. These relationships were inscribed within the realities of the social space through the structuring of the dwelling places of the living, the village, the neighborhood, and the dwelling place of the dead, the cemetery. The proximity of graves and houses supported and justified the living person's intense concern with the dead. Similarly, the religious and material hold that the church and the clerics had over lay society grew appreciably after the beginning of the 10th century. Now, if you know me, you know I am obsessed with the beginning of the 10th century because something fucking happened. And I want to know what it was. I've always wanted to know, but I want to know specifically what the thing was. And so the reason I talk to Rob is because he says he knows, but he's not telling me. So, pay me so that I can spend more time with him. And maybe someday, man, this antler is wearing me out. Maybe someday he'll tell me. It enabled an inculcation of the faithful with a religious morality centered on the notions of sin, penance, and salvation, culminating at the end of the 12th century in the birth of purgatory. Henceforth, all Christians could hope to be saved but only under the conditions that after death they would undergo salutary punishments, the duration and the intensity of which depended both on personal merits, good and bad acts, and repentance at the time of death, and on the suffrage, masses, prayers, and almsgiving undertaken by relatives and friends for the dead's salvation. Otherwise, the dead person might appear to be a relative or a close friend to demand the suffrages needed and ask the living to do the pious works necessary for the dead person's salvation. Eager to support and organize the unity of the living and the dead, the church gladly repeated tales of ghosts. Far from simply being the maleficent dead found in all cultures due to upheavals or to the fortuitous absence of the rite of passage offered by a funeral, far from simply being the products of old pagan beliefs, these ghosts express in a more general way, through their return and phantasms, fears, and the tales of the living, the potential multiple dysfunctions of a good Christian death. And here I do want to stop because this is a great book and a good read, and want I do want to spend time with this, real time with this with you. So this might go in the books you need to have read. So check it out. I'll read it for you over the course of months, like Dad would have done if Dad was reading you bedtime stories that A, pissed him off, and B, were way too philosophical. Hey, who needs to die back there? Why is this happening? Neither of you needs to be in here, and neither of you needs to be making so much noise. I apologize for the cats. I'm not sorry about the cats, but those are cats, and cats are going to be cats. I'm not actually going to hurt them. I might a little bit, but not while I'm on mic. Oh, this antler is wearing me out tonight. Okay. Having forgotten exactly what I wanted to talk about because of the cats, I'm going to blame the cats. Hey, okay, Tigger, come on. Out. Out. Just get out of here. In the box is also fine. On the box is distracting and annoying. Yeah, today the head thing is not happening today. I'm sorry, guys. Too many distractions. I'm also head itchy. My alopecia is doing the thing it does. So thank you for that. Okay, enjoy my hat hair, ladies and gentlemen. We return cold to Jane Roberts. You can read the first two if you care about context to that. I'm not reading this to a live audience as far as I can tell. Thank you for being here. Thank you for tolerating me. Thank you for ignoring my stupid looking hair now that my hair looks so dumb. I don't care. Other people care about that stuff. Okay. We return to Jane Roberts pretending to be William James. That can get me sued. But we return it at any rate. Thursday morning, January 27, 1977. If we turn back, the last time she wrote was Wednesday afternoon, January 26, 1977. So she's getting back to it faster. She's getting excited to write this, but in her excitement to write it and her eagerness, she's forgotten to think about the most important thing she's doing, and that's whether a spirit like the ghost of a dead person is going to be thinking in the way that she's portraying him as thinking. Is he on his end of the television line? I understand that what she's trying to say is that because he's timeless, there's no time between these messages to him. But from his perspective, he does have to initiate and disconnect the connection. And so if they're not close like her and Seth are, like, so it makes sense that Seth's like, all right, take your break and I'll do it again. But she's not mentioning in here that she's asking the ghost for breaks. And the ghost keeps telling us that he is taking her brain. So she's not thinking about the ghost's temporal experience, because you have, even if you're a disembodied entity, even if you're a ghost, you still have a temporal experience. There's still a linear narrative that's happening to you. You can't be in all places at all times. You're not God. And even God has a linear narrative. It's just already happened and he's watching the DVD over again. That's And even when he's doing it, he remembers the end because he's already done it again. He's already done it. So every time he does anything, it's the billionth to the nth degree time he's doing it, because he's already done it that many times. Plus, he's going to do it that many times more again. William James says, I was modest and secretive in my ways. I strove to be mannerly without overdoing protocol, and adventuresome without accusing others of undue timidity. I don't think that's true. Um, my understanding of William James is that he was a hard ass and he called everybody a coward. With my colleagues and in the academic halls, I could allow my creativity reign. That is, I dared to speak about issues like mysticism and cosmic consciousness. He didn't dare, everyone was. It was only unpopular for him to speak about those things in the Scottish school, but they weren't all of philosophy. I gave some stirring speeches that aroused in my listeners those aspiring emotions of faith and hope. In speaking, I felt faith and hope. Yet I allowed myself such emotional luxury only because I was surrounded by an emotional economy and dryness that would automatically temper my enthusiasm. I don't know that I can comment on whether that could even possibly be true or not. And, always speaking, my demeanor was reasonable, and that those feelings were not allowed to affect my actions in such a way as to cause embarrassment. My pronunciation was so correct, for example, that its very preciseness served to rein in any permissiveness that emotionally tinged words might otherwise, and quite normally, suggest. And do we really think that he would use rain twice? A person who was trained in the oral tradition? This is a person who spent most of his speaking engagements to people who weren't reading the subtitles. Do we really think he would have used REIGN and REIN in the same sentence about the same thing, that he gave it rain and reined it in? That makes no sense that he would do that. This is just and only bad writing. It's bad science fiction. Don't be taken by this. Professionally, I was regarded as avant-garde in my fashion because I did give voice to subjects avoided by others, and because I tried to, in however cautious a manner, to introduce questions of the soul to scientific speculation. It's not true. He talks repeatedly about how questions of the soul can't be subjected to scientific speculation. In the seance room, my natural modesty was offended by the exuberant, sometimes rambunctious creativity I found there, the almost tawdry overindulgence and energetic power. At the same time, I was often in awe, as one is when faced with the sheer vitality displayed by the very young, undisciplined, unadult, unreasonable by usual standards, but hinting at such raw power that the adult wonders at the forgotten energy of his own youth. And this is just not how he wrote. He just didn't like young people like that. I don't remember that in any of what I've read from William James. I don't know why she's saying this about him, and I really don't understand what the political and spiritual motivation is for the young. And in 78, I think she was in her 40s. So why is she encouraging through his voice young people to overturn, other than because the 70s are the 70s, but the 60s are her politics. So why is William James encouraging 1960s politics? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense from an intellectual standpoint. It doesn't make sense to write. It doesn't make sense to read. It doesn't make sense to argue with, and it just doesn't make sense to take seriously. So who takes it seriously? Someone took it seriously, or it wouldn't exist. My hair is just going to look like I've got hat head for the rest of my life, and I just have to stare at that and deal with that. It's quite possible that my own disciplined manner elicited such response on the part of mediums, in particular, for I had a reputation of scientific objectivity to uphold. No sleight of hand or emotional ploy could be allowed to dull my wits. And this scientific objectivity thing is an obsession of the 1960s. This is not an obsession of the 19. He was not a philosopher of the 1900s. He died in 1910. You don't count if you only wrote. Look, sure, fine. The books are from the 1900s if he published however many of them. and at least 3 of his works were published in 19 and before 1912. But that's irrelevant. That's irrelevant to the point of whether he was a thinker whose thoughts came from the 1900s. Couldn't have. He was born in the 1800s. His thoughts were thoroughly 1800. Maybe 1890, but thoroughly 1800. Damn, I don't know what I have to do to get some privacy and silence outside my room. It's quite possible that my own disciplined manner elicited such response on the part of mediums in particular, for I had a reputation of scientific objectivity to uphold. I don't know why. I don't know why. I do. Okay, so you can speculate about why. I don't know why William James's ghost needs to talk so much about mediums and how mediums responded to him and what mediums have said about him in the interlude of his life. Because if he was worried about what mediums were saying about him during his life, he was a stupid person. But if we occupy that mindset, okay, well, what would a stupid person do? And we project, okay, well, what would a stupid person do into the back of our head, and we beam it onto the front wall of our mind's eye like Plato's fucking cave. Well, a stupid person would say, man, I sure have heard a lot of mediums say that guy was a dickhead. So maybe what actually happened, because I don't know, but just recreating from what Jane Roberts is saying here, and Jane Roberts is a stupid person. I've already established how that's possible. I am going to get fucking sued for this. I just know it. Anyway, um, we've already defined stupid using Teresa of Avila in this piece, so I'm not actually being derogatory. I'm saying she doesn't know what the fuck she's talking about, and she can't know what the fuck she's talking about because God actually bars her from experiencing anything remotely like truth. The only thing that Jane Roberts can experience is the demonic, is the delusive, because God withholds from her because of what she wants to do with the information. But it sounds like what is true is that a lot of 20th century, so let's say from 1910 to 1978, a lot of New York and etc. authors in New Age and Spiritism and just spirituality in general, so mediums in general, were critical of William James after his death. It's quite possible that my own disciplined manner elicited such response on the part of mediums. Am I going to read this? I'm going to read that sentence just all over and over and over. Some such mediums were simply psychic frauds, plying their trade and yet performing a service in their way. For to these humble living rooms, furnished with religious emblems, pictures of Christ and the saints, came the poor and disturbed. Oh, I read this. I'm sorry. I meant to start on January 27th, Thursday afternoon. She picks back up that same day. I apologize for my lack of professionalism. Yet it was precisely to such Mrs. Chowder's back parlors that I was often led, hat hesitantly in hand, skeptical eyes politely lowered, as initially I spied out the lay of the land. For it was difficult to see how miracles of the spirit could emerge from such grubby settings, chipped wainscoting, dirty doorsteps, entire rooms saturated with the intermixed odors of incense, candle wax, boiling onions, potatoes, or beef of the poorest persuasion, garlic, cough potions, and other spices or oils of musty but otherwise mysterious properties. I'm going to kill a cat. Get out! This is why I don't do this much. Let's just be honest between the two of us. I live in severe emotional abuse, um, not just emotional, intellectual, psychic, spiritual, physical abuse. And this base disrespect, the inability to keep her animals from interrupting me like this, is why I don't do this. I get upset. I get frustrated. I see that zero remain a zero, and I just don't, because who's going to know the difference? I'm going to have read this book one way or another. Eventually, I will have read this book one way or the other or another. I will have thought the thoughts that I'm thinking here one way or another. And so long as I'm doing this for free, in abuse, being constantly disrespected, for trying to help you make sense of your reality, is permanently discouraging. I'm very angry right now. Could the recipe of the soul's comfort be mixed in such kitchens? Better to keep on your muffler. Wind it about your nose to keep out the noxious odors. Sit down and get to business, leaving such questions and mutterings for a more comfortable moment. For our work was more intimately concerned with homey paraphernalia than our scientific documents might show, and also connected in most devious ways with the passing of the seasons. And what she's trying to say is that he was a collector of fetishes and idols, and I don't know whether that's true. For example, our investigations were twice as complicated in the winter, for rather amusing reasons not at first apparent, particularly in Boston, where the dampness had a bone chilling effect that even the sunny minded felt most acutely. And here we go. So I've talked a lot about how this is just bad historical fiction. And so what she's doing is when she runs out of what she knows she wants to say, because she's lying when she says that it comes over her, and then she has to quickly get it out before she can't before it's on. What it is she has to quickly get it on page before she forgets what it was. She scripts, and that's why they're so short. Is she can remember the first few paragraphs, and then she just has to say them over and over and over and over again. That's why this is so much longer than his real prose. Ladies, therefore, went about fully decked, even in their households, with layers upon layers of wool and muslins beneath their skirts, to say nothing of their shawls, sweaters, capes, and aprons that they wore atop. And my point here is that she wrote the last chapter and then thought, okay, so there's a little bit of a biography. And then she got to thinking, well, that's not the only thing that his life would have been like. That's not the only biographical information that a spirit might want to give to people. He might actually want to do some pathology, or not some pathos building, and describe what his lived experience was like. And so if you've ever read bad historical fiction, or you've ever read just bad fiction writing in general, bad character development, this is how it looks. It's just random. The details about their lives just show up at random, and they're unconnected to a narrative. They're unconnected to the plot. What she has done is she doesn't know what her plot is, because and she gets to make that claim that she doesn't have a plot and she doesn't have to plot this out because it's channeled. A ghost is writing this. And look, I know there's a criticism there for my own work. My own work has a plot, though. Winter then provided legitimate excuse for bulky underclothing that was often used not so much for warmth as for the concealment of magnets to make tables move, nuts cracked together to make wrappings, and scribbled messages on pieces of paper that later materialized as if freshly written on by the dead, a little piece of blank paper being first obviously placed on the table and later quickly replaced with the concealed one. And so now I don't know what Jane Roberts' point is in telling you how the cold reading of the seance room worked, but this is how the seance room worked. So there's a certain amount of Jane Roberts, the author, Jane Roberts, needs to be honest with you about the fact of 19th century seance rooms, because she's trying to get you in one, and she's trying to charge you something ridiculous like $1,500 to be there. In 1978, $1,500. It took the greatest of courage, the most delicate coughing, the most gentle yet demanding of glances, for an investigator, under such circumstances, to suggest that the good woman's clothing might be concealing more than ample hips or bosom, and those men brave enough in certain situations to request permission to search the lady's underpinnings were accused of having more than scientific interests on their minds. I've never heard of this. I've never heard of men strip searching mediums. And if they did, there was absolutely no embarrassment about it. A woman's body was not her own before the 1960s. if you were defrauding rich men, the first thing they were going to do was strip you naked. They were absolutely going to embarrass you, and then they were going to keep your clothing. In that chill northeastern climate, however, and in the evening when many seances were held, there was a certain charm, perhaps, who knows, an innocent enough hope that against the deeper winter of the soul, here such homey ingredients might spark those necessary elements of the heart that must, if any do, unite the living and the dead. And if we remember, I was going to revisit, I probably actually said in the comments that I was going to revisit um, does consciousness exist? And then I ran long on a thing that I didn't announce I was going to read, and that's fine. But this doesn't sound anything like him. He just didn't write like this. He was deliberate in his writing, and I just don't believe that he waxed poetic and said sentences over and over and over from different ways. I just don't believe he did that. The scientist well knew that he lacked whatever emotional impetus might be needed, so the circumstances as he might, he also felt himself to be an outsider, a watcher, seeing what spark the emotions of the others might provide that he could use. And this is just false. His pragmatism and the meaning of truth, he outright says the exact opposite of that, that the scientist is the informed observer, and that the scientist actually has an ethical and moral and religious responsibility to be a leader in the world. That's kind of where the Nazis came to the idea to be Nazis. Also, alas, we were often deceived, and yet, as I shall explain later, not deceived, but taught deeper lessons than we knew. I was acquainted with the rudiments of hypnosis, as were many of my colleagues. He was. And while we spoke about suggestion from our side, it never really occurred to us that many of these unlettered women were far better hypnotists than we. And in fact, um, I can remember, and I might be misquoting, but I can remember in the varieties of religious experience that he specifically didn't talk about female mediums because he didn't feel comfortable. And well, whether he felt comfortable as a man and therapist and scientist and philosopher and interviewer to interview him, or he knew they were too cagey to sit down with a man of his intellectual stature, I don't know, but I can remember him saying, in fact, that he didn't talk to them, and mostly not denigrating them, mostly just saying there's nothing to be said there. It's mostly a shell game. That they learn techniques more effective, quicker, and often more pleasant than our own. He did talk a lot about Mesmer, the guy who invented mesmerism or hypnotism. He did talk a lot about him, but he talked about him as there's something happening there, but it's not whatever Mesmer says it is. Or that indeed they understood better than we the dictates, needs, and yearnings of the human heart. The lessons usually escaped us. I recall how often I fussed and fumed, stomped angrily from a dark front porch out into the waiting carriage, deriding in low but fierce tones the transparent trickeries of some woman I had caught in fraud. I had indeed perceived deceptions, ectoplasm made of cotton, the entire roll once dragged out in the middle of a seance by the family cat. But the sitters who should have been angriest turned their ire on me rather than upon the perpetrator of the deception. And that's not necessarily untrue. Typically, people who are taken by seances and then a debunker comes around and proves them wrong, typically, you know, your UFO buff, your ancient aliens guy is going to get mad, but that's just what happens when you get conned is you get mad at the person who proves you a con because then you owe them the money that you were giving the con actually. That's actually true. It never happens, but whatever salary you were giving away is no longer yours. It's been separated to you because fools and their money are parted. So you've already parted with the money that you determined or pledged to give to the con man. And so when a debunker comes around and says, "Don't give your money to them," they're actually saying, "You owe that money to me now. The balance of the money that you have that you didn't give to them is actually belonged to me, but I'm refusing it because I'm a good person." That's how that actually works. And there was something important here. I'm going to reread this. Oh, the ectoplasm thing. I've been telling you over and over and over again in these first three parts. The first two parts, I said it a whole bunch of times, but I'm going to say it again. I have to predict what she's going to talk about. So I was talking to you in this is, I believe, chapter 4. She doesn't number the subchapters. I believe this is subchapter 4 of chapter 1, and I talked about ectoplasm last time because I have to predict her. If I don't predict her, if I don't predict what's going to be in the book, I can't prove that I know more about this than A, she does, or B, you do. And if I don't know more about this, in fact, why are we doing this? What am I? What am I? That Blue Jay guy? What am I? What am I? Am I these historian fans? Am I Dan Carlin? What am I? If I'm sitting up here and I'm telling you about things that are deep and important, but I don't know any more than the people I'm saying may or may not know anything. Poor, ignorant people, I would think, shaking my head, missing an important point entirely. And that's not him. That's just not what he was like. That's what his face is like. And that is what philosophers are like. But that's not how he talked. It's not how he wrote. And so if she's trying to say that she knows his inner self better than he does, he would qualify and couch this. He wouldn't say it like this. And he most certainly wouldn't say that in life he missed an important point. He probably went to his death believing that he had missed none of the points. This is the point that he missed entirely, according to him, his ghost. The medium's excellent use of hypnosis was such that even in the face of disclosure, her sitters literally heard her voice only, her arguments, and she had convinced them, all evidence to the contrary, that they had been visited by the dead. In a fashion, this was as much an extraordinary performance as a legitimate visitation of the deceased, for the sitters believed what they saw under the medium's suggestions, even when the props were shown to be deceptive. And I am sitting here telling you that this book is deceptive, and what Jane Roberts is doing is already, she has to predict what you're going to do too. I have to predict what she's going to do because she's predicting what you're going to do because she's trying to mind fuck you, and I'm trying to at least give you a fucking condom. So what she's telling you here is that even though people knew that the con man, the seance was bullshit, they wanted to believe. And so if you want to believe Jane Roberts, you're going to think I'm the worst kind of vile human being. The ghost turns out to be the medium's younger sister, parading through the darkened room in slippers, or the plaintive moan mama proves to be the neighbor's child hidden behind the drapery. Paid a penny for each mama cried on cue. And there ends that section. There's no beginning, there's no middle, there's no end. And I understand the idea is that it's supposed to be like a dream, like a trance. Like he had this one thing and it was this important for him to say. But he was such a good writer. He was so eloquent and so thoughtful and so well educated. I just cannot believe that what he would do. I'm going to count the paragraphs like an absolute dickhead. What I cannot believe that he would do is write 8 paragraphs that describe his life like a bad historical fiction writer. She sat down to write about what the seasons of his life were like in Boston and then realized that she knows fuck all about 19th century Boston, and then just went right back to his to criticizing his private thoughts. That right there is called the historian's fallacy, and it's just called being a bad person. So then we jump forward another 2 days. It took her some time. She didn't like what she'd written, but she doesn't edit. She's not going to go back and edit it. Fuck that. She's got deadlines she's trying to meet. So January 28th. Oh, in the morning. Actually, she's getting ramped up. She's starting to really hit this frequently. I said that wrong. Returning to William James' voice. One of our errors was in regarding the intellect alone as capable of judgments and as the final arbiter of events. And that's impossible. That was one of his errors, because William James wouldn't have used the word intellect in the way that a person in 1977 does. Feelings and sentiments can be used, should be used also for the emotions, make their own judgments of reality, and it is against those more volatile opinions that we ultimately assess our acts. And this is thoroughly 1970s pseudopsychology. What she's talking about, this emotions being superior to the intellect thing, that is thoroughly 1970s, and it's thoroughly mind fucked you because people believe it and they've taught it to you. That is, the emotions can provide a legitimate, though different, framework with which to test the results of any event, paranormal or otherwise, and the emotions' truth may respond to an inner objective reality that has its own rules and values that are not mysterious or hidden, but perceivable if you use the proper measuring tool. And this is not William James speaking. This is Jane Roberts telling you a lie. She's telling you that happiness can be an end goal. I told you last time that what she did is she's taken everything good from every worldview system, every single religion, every single cult, every good idea everybody has ever had, and she's using William James to tell you they were wrong. So what she's telling you is that the ignore your emotions of the Stoic is Jen. The ignore your emotions of the Stoic is actually going to send you to hell, and that what you need to do is psychopathologize your emotions and obsess over your emotions, and that the hell that we're in today of obsessing over the quest for happiness is actually the right move to make, that what the future wants to do is get to a place where they're obsessing over whether they're happy or not. And just ask your life, are you happier when you obsess about whether you're happy or not? Such a proposition is most difficult to defend intellectually. It's not most difficult, it's impossible. No one has ever successfully defended this. And so, in large part, what Jane Roberts is trying to do is say, no, 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 I'm educated and I'm smart and I'm X, Y, and Z thing that William James was, and that these polymaths of the ain't no, the early, let's say early modern period, but that's not right. The Renaissance, these Renaissance people, I can be like that. And I feel you, Jane. I feel you, babe. It's hard being looked down on by these people who say you're not smart enough because you couldn't handle university, because you just don't have the temperament to be told what you have to think and what you have to say in order to move on to the next class. I fucking get it, Jane. But no one has ever come to the conclusion that what you're saying works. Your emotions don't work. Even women, even even women in the magical traditions of like Isis. What Isis is doing is teaching Osiris how to shelve his emotions, and that his emotions are going to get him killed, and that responding to your emotions is the Patriot Act and panic, and that's what panic is. That's what Pan is the god of emotion, and panic is literally overwhelming emotion. This, what she's saying, is nonsensical and wrong in every tradition. So there's I understand so much. I understand the impulse to want people to believe that you're smart, but you have to also be right. You don't just get to say things. A ghost told me this, and well, the ghost knows everything. Well, I was just reading to you a book that later on in that book is going on to explain to you that it's actually never been true before the 1960s that ghosts had access to infinite knowledge. What actually happens is that necromancers and people who talked to the dead were always pissed off because the ghosts would fucking lie. Augustine writes about it, that necromancers are completely unreliable because the ghosts are lying and they know they're lying. And so what you have to do is you have to parse out the truth from the lies. And we're just, no, Jane, no, we're not doing that. And I've already read from you from the Book of Lies, whether the audio took or not. And I'm sorry, podcast audience, you just don't get that audio. But saying nonsensical things in lies and then publishing it and then expecting people to, well, you can find it for yourself. This relativistic bullshit is bullshit. A novel, she continues in William James' voice to say, can be true in the deepest sense. For example, though the details within it are quite false in scientific terms, if the places and people mentioned therein do not exist in fact. And now she's writing in the same, I believe, actually the same very decade as I can never remember his name, but damn, Death of the Author guy. And so this is just Platonism. What she's trying to do is rewrite Christianity. And she's trying to say that every metaphor is metaphorically true, but it's also literally true. And I've already told you that literal truth just means that you believe some shit you read in a book and you believed it was true. So what she's saying is literal truth can also be literal truth. And what she's saying is nothing. The scientist judging such a work by the rules of his own discipline alone might indeed entirely miss the dimensions of the artistic, creative world, or dismiss such works as beneath serious adult consideration. And again, she's not talking about the 19th century. She's talking about the 20th century. This is what life in the 1970s was like. I know that because I've watched a single movie from the 1970s. There's always one guy who's like, I have a science degree. I have a BA in science, and that means that you have to listen to everything I say, and I'm smarter than you, and I die early in the movie. Always. Every 1970s movie is like that. She's just arguing with the 1970s because her worldview was given to her by Madame Blavatsky and horror movies. And here's the thing. Horror movies are an art that you can take seriously. In fact, you could really dive into the the British studio that I can no longer remember. You could really dive into those movies in the 70s as serious works, not just of art, but of literature and of philosophy, because they were dealing in cult themes that they were taking seriously. Maybe the writers didn't know what they were doing, but the studios knew what they were doing. Hammer knew what they were doing. I've already told you that uh, I just forgot her name, and I've worked so hard. Meredith Blackburn. She made a counter studio to Hollywood. She tried to make a whole town that was about making movies, and they were a cult. So horror movies. She made horror movies. Meredith Blackburn did. Horror movies are cult, and they are absolutely serious movies. They should be taken serious. They are art. But what she's trying to say is that they are more valid than reading her own work. Think about that. She's telling you that a horror movie is more valid than sitting and taking the time to read her own work. And Jen, I agree. It's sad. The fictional events of the novel are symbolic statements about inner emotional realities that have deep validity. There is a definite correspondence between such imaginative events and the objective world. And I do agree with her. The fantasy or the fiction writer has something important to say. We're in a world now where people are deliberately ignoring the warnings of 19th and 20th century science fiction. We're deliberately ignoring the warnings of the Shaver mysteries. We're deliberately ignoring the warnings that can be found in Orwell and H.G. Wells, not to name drop them in every single podcast I do, but we're deliberately ignoring Asimov. We're deliberately ignoring Phil Dick. I don't know all of them. We're deliberately ignoring the Terminator and the Aliens franchise because we're desperate for change for change's sake. We're desperate for any kind of new catastrophe because we're desperate. We are desperate as human beings, have been desperate as human beings for 200 years. It's all over Madame Blavatsky's work. We are desperate for a genetic bottleneck. We are desperate for a near extinction event of the species. That's what liberalism is searching for. They're trying to bring the fucking spirit bomb down on our heads. They're literally trying to drop the moon on the planet if necessary. The trouble is, of course, that this correspondence is not measurable in usual terms. To dismiss it for that reason, however, would be to rob the world of its invaluable artistic heritage and accomplishment. William James did write like this. He loved art. He was a huge fan of Ivanhoe, the novel. While I became in life more and more disillusioned with the results of paranormal investigations, therefore, I became in time more and more convinced that the fictionalized events of many seance rooms, those spooky dramas formed of desperate hopes, emotional frenzies, creative fabrications, and subconscious dramatizations, those morality plays in miniature, occurring in neighborhood after neighborhood, stood for inner realities. Um, I don't know whether William James did that, but that is what happens to everyone who goes from reading the Bible to reading extra biblical literature to reading fiction to reading extra Abrahamic scripture back to reading the Bible to reading fiction, etc. That is what happens to you. It happened to me. It's happened to me many times, and that's called Platonism, where you think that everything is real just because somebody thought it. I call it Rule 33 because Rule 34 is if you thought it, there's porn of it. Well, if you thought it exists, probably, but the way I say it is if you like it, two people, or if you like to do it, as goes the rules in kink, if you like to do it, someone likes it done to you, and where there's one person who likes it and one person who likes it done, there are two. And the so what that means is that cult is a natural byproduct of human behavior. If you like doing it, someone else will like doing it, and then you can find a whole group of people who want to do it with you. That's very real, and that's what she's encouraging you. And I would actually encourage you to find a group of people who like the things you like. I would just encourage you to also leave that group if they want you to dislike things they dislike. Because when you like things that people like and dislike things that they like, you will kill someone. Someone will die. They symbolized inner facts, if you prefer, even when they were fraudulent, and held the same correspondence to events after death as conventional novels or plays did to daily life. And now everyone before the modern era did believe this. Well, I shouldn't say everyone. It was split in half. But this is a thing that people talked about in his time. We could compare the works of art to the events they symbolized, and now she's back to talking about 1970s literary criticism and Barthes. Barthes is his name. It might even be Roman Barthes, but Barthes, he's a French guy. Barthes. He's the guy who came up with Death of the Author, and he ruined he ruined literature. He ruined literary criticism. Barthes did. I'll have to do that. I've tried to do that so many times, but I'll have to do that piece later. Returning to William James. The seance is, however, a social event, and that there are participants and audience oftentimes, and we are faced by the same problems that witnesses provide whenever they are expected to state clearly the bare facts of their experience. And he is trying to say, here, I am going to insist that William James did not do this. I have tried to be nice, but I can't be nice for another hour. I can't pledge that. Jane Roberts here is describing to you. I don't know why why a ghost would be obsessed with the details of a seance room, but I can absolutely tell you why a practicing spiritist would be interested in the behavior of a seance room and distancing herself from the very real evils of the seance room that were becoming popular to talk about in the 1970s again, because the Amazing Randy happened. Like, I don't have to do what I'm doing. I don't have to debunk this. The Amazing Randy and Joe Nichols happened. They happened. You can find their work. They're amazing, incorrigible douchebags, but you could only be an amazing, incorrigible douchebag in the 1970s. Like, if you wanted to get on TV before 2009, you had to be an incorrigible, but also amazing douchebag. Such are the powers of the creative imagination. See what I mean? Like, you have to think in this terms. You have to think about things like creative imagination in order to get on TV at all. That, again, that is what they're talking about in The Network. That's a fucking amazing movie, and it's in my recency bias, so you just get to deal with me talking about it a lot. Such participants may, in fact, that is physically, perceive the fictionalized events, may actually see the apparition under the suggestion of the medium in a psychological drama in which the medium herself is convinced of the apparition's appearance. Because, like the scientist, perhaps, she trusts the evidence of her senses. Now, this is interesting because when you read books, sometimes you can, like, ghost books, but sometimes if you get really into the imaginative or the co-creative, let's say, when you're reading a book of fiction and it's really got you, and you're participating in imagining the world. It's a co-creation that's happening between you and artist, you and author, you and storyteller. And she's not wrong um, about that there is something happening. And she's decidedly not wrong in 2024 that science has absolutely no desire to touch that with any amount of stick. It could be the diameter, what's half of the circumference of the planet, and they wouldn't want to touch that because they can't touch that. If you read the spirit if you read the spirit molecule, I believe it's called DMT, the spirit molecule. They also did a documentary, but if you read the experimental work and then you read the literary critical work that the original author published, Science doesn't want to touch the mind with any stick. They wouldn't touch the mind from the center of the universe, from the heat death of the universe. They don't want it because it becomes self-critical. And scientists spend all of their time assuming they're mentally retarded. And what they do not want to know is that they are, in fact, going to die spiritually retarded. There's just too much work to be done. And frankly, I respect that. I do. Look at me. Look at me. Like, let's be honest. And those senses might indeed show her the shadowy image of a person. And I don't know what it is, but there is something to the fact that the mediums that you're aware of, and that the what is it, stereotype, the trope of the medium is a female. It wasn't always. The necromancer was almost exclusively male before the near modern, before Blavatsky. So I don't know what happened. That has to have something to do with feminism, but it's also got something to do with neo-Viking paganism, neo-Norman paganism. She is. Thank you. I thank you, Jen. The deceased, clearly positioned. She may hear words which she repeats for the sitter, taking it for granted that no fraud exists in such a hypothetical case. What are we to say? We must say that we do not understand perception itself. So I told myself. I don't know that we don't understand perception. I understand that I see differently than you do. I understand that, like, this black is a different shade to me than it is to you. But I also know that that's entirely irrelevant to our shared lived experience unless we're both dyers, or you want me to recreate the exact shade of black that you see and I see a different one. The only way that's relevant is if we are artists at the highest levels of practice. Practice, not abstraction. Practice. It doesn't matter what shade blue is. When I say blue and you think blue, if you think chartreuse or you think sky or you think the robin's egg, doesn't matter. I said blue and you thought blue. When I wrote in my book, I saw a big mountain. It doesn't matter whether you see Everest or whether you see the Alps. It's a big mountain. And if it's a fictional mountain, it really doesn't matter because it's not a real mountain. That's what Barth is trying to tell you. That's what she's trying to tell you with the death of the author, that that the author's, what's in the author's mind visually, like, okay, so like let's use a specific hard world example. Tolkien. When he described Gimli to you, he had a specific Gimli in his mind. But if you have a different Gimli in your mind, that doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter that you have a different Captain America in your mind when you look at Chris Evans in costume in all those movies. It doesn't matter, because what matters is that you relate to the story and that you take something away from the story that makes you better. And man, it's hard for me to read this and go, yeah, I'm better for having read this. The trouble is, of course, that this correspondence is not measurable in usual terms. To dismiss it for that reason, however, would be to rob the world of its invaluable artistic heritage and accomplishment. While I became in life more and more disillusioned with the results of paranormal investigations, therefore, I became in time more and more convinced that the fictionalized events of many seance rooms, those spooky dramas formed of desperate hopes, emotional frenzies, creative fabrications, and subconscious dramatizations, those morality plays in miniature occurring in neighborhood after neighborhood, stood for inner realities. They symbolized inner facts, if you prefer, even when they were fraudulent, and held the same correspondence to events after death as conventional novels or plays did to daily life. And again, I probably read that paragraph a second time, but I needed to prove that she's being relativistic and she's being Barthian. And I'm saying William James could not have thought in these terms. All of these things happened after he died. All of these ideas happened after he died. He could not think in these terms without her brain. And so what that means is that she's saying her inner thoughts with someone else's voice. This is an elaborate writing prompt. And just like, look, I love the Twitter audience that's in my ear and whatever. But those I think they're called VSS feeds. They annoy the shit out of me. You're not going to find any depth there. Now, my friends who use it aren't going to be offended by me saying that because they aren't doing it for depth. They're doing it for practice. But look at this. This isn't a big book, but it's not also a monograph. It's not 10,000 words. It's like I can out a 10,000 word monograph in an afternoon, and it'll be front to start, but it'll be about a thing, and it might not be finished. It might not finished. It might not be holistic, or it might not be. There's a word I'm searching for. There's a word that people want a thing to be when they read a book: comprehensive. But here's the thing: comprehensive is impossible from a scholarly perspective, and sell it. If you look at the rise and fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbons, Edward, I think his first name is, it's like 9 volumes. It's like this many books. Where's my other hand? It's like this many books. It's a stupid number of books. It's a lifetime of reading to be comprehensive. And fuck that. That's too much effort. It's too much effort to be comprehensive about Jane Roberts. Not when I've only made $10 doing this. It's too much. We can compare the works of art to the events they symbolized, but the reality of the afterlife presents us, hey, look, it's there. There it is. She used the title. I'm so proud of her, actually. I'm actually really proud of her. The reality of the afterlife presents us in life with no ready yardstick with which to measure what truths or inner facts reside in the seance or other such psychological events. Now I'm confused. I was so proud of her, and now I'm mad at her again. Why is the afterlife experience meditating? I know I'm thinking about the ghost book, but she's saying it too. When did the afterlife become meditating on everything you do wrong? She has a neo-Egyptian worldview, and in the 70s, by 76 is when 77 is when she's actually writing this. It's published in 78, so I think from the perspective of her audience, but I should be thinking from her perspective more frequently. Point being, by 78, we had pretty good Egyptology. I'm pretty sure we had deciphered the Rosetta Stone, so the hieroglyphs, by 78. I think that was in like the 1890s. Anyway, maybe not. It doesn't matter. Where I spent, you don't know this about me. I have a lot of ideas that are all suddenly jammed up in my brain all at the same time. I shouldn't ask for a second. What happened to the psychopomp tradition? I got all tripped up over myself about psychopomps because I was reading ancient mythology, and they weren't there. There just weren't psychopomps there. Let me define a psychopomp. I'm talking to someone who's not present, and I'm sorry for that. A psychopomp is a figure in the afterlife who takes the deceased to their final resting place. So in the terms of I shouldn't use Egypt, Greece, because I don't remember the names. In the terms of Greece, it's the guy that takes you across the river Styx. His name is Charon. There's that boat, right? In Egypt, they had the feather. They had the heart weighing ceremony that made its way into Christianity. But you if you failed, you were eaten. Your heart was eaten. But if you succeeded, you weren't just teleported there. There wasn't a teleportation back in the day. So Egypt didn't have, like, Egyptian theologians didn't have gods who teleported places. I know that. I know that's a fact because I've been reading Zecharia Sitchin, and Zecharia Sitchin is convinced they had flying machines, spacecraft, because they talk about how they had chariots that could fly. People understood vehicles. People have always understood vehicles. And people understand the distances between places. Even if I don't know what the actual distance between me and California is, I understand that it's longer than a few minutes. And that if I'm going to get there, I'm going to need a vehicle, and I'm going to need a good one. A very good one. And so the gods had vehicles. The gods didn't just teleport. Like Hermes had winged shoes so he could fly really fast. He could fly at the speed of a run. Like, these metaphors are not sophisticated. They're actually kind of funny because the people who came up with them were very smart, but the people they were communicating to were dogs that had language. Like, we're talking intellectually when we say things like, "Oh, dog has the intellect, has the intellectual capacity of a 3-year-old child." We're talking about people who were expressing the intellectual capacity of very, very, very small modern children because of ideas that came out of, like, Einstein saying if you use X% of your brain, you'll be like Y. I've lost the thread of what the fuck we were talking about, but I do want to know why he's so obsessed with the seance. It's weird. The seance is, however, a social event in that there are participants and audience. Oh, I said that part. Such are the powers of the creative imagination that such participants may, in fact, that is physically perceive the fictionalized events. More on this later. But if we looked at the seance as a creative, dramatic, psychological event, we can at least compare it to other more conventional dramas, such as the religious or artistic productions and ceremonies. We have, for example, a set of conventions and a loose cast of characters, the Indian guides, doctors, philosophers, poets, and other personae, the denizens of the dead, in other words, who serve as controls or mediators between the medium and the deceased. And here she introduces King for the win. Yeah, absolutely, Jen. Here she introduces psychopomps again. Thank you again, Jen. I will eventually do this earlier in the day. It just takes me a little while right now to work up the emotional gumption, and I was, feeling itchy. But here she's talking about introducing the idea of psychopomps. And so again, I need to be thinking ahead of her because I need to be predicting her so that I can be guessing where she's going, so that I cannot let her surprise me, so that I cannot be taken advantage of. And also, I need to prove to you that I know what the fuck I'm talking about so I can generate an income off this, people. I would like to eat hot food most days. That's a goal I have. Perhaps these are artificial productions, fictionalized characters coming to life, so to speak, through the medium's gestures, voice, and actions, instead of simply appearing on the printed page as the main characters of a novelist's art. And then she loses herself by going back to the camera obscura. Just look at what you're looking at. Stop trying to talk about something else. So after World War One, uh, a lot happened in literary criticism. A lot happened in storytelling. A lot changed in storytelling after World Wars One, but especially World War Two. After World War Two, a lot changed. Between the invention of the nation state, so 1600s, it's a bad date, but circa 1600, and the end of World War One, the writer was allowed to write under their name, a tradition which would have been balked at before then, would have been considered hubristic, and would have gotten you burned, your body of work, but maybe even your body. Um, you were allowed to do that if you were doing propaganda for a state. So if you were supporting the state with your story, you were allowed to write under your name. We have the names of people before that who wrote, like Thomas Mallory or Marie de France, or I just forgot his other name, or the other guy's name. I had one I really wanted to say. I can't believe I pulled Thomas Mallory out of my head, actually. He's who I thought I was going to struggle with. Chrétien de Troyes. These men and women, Marie de France, um, their names are Geoffrey of Monmouth, even. Their names have survived to history because they weren't writing fiction. They weren't writing scripture. They weren't writing myth. They were doing what the Brothers Grimm were doing, and they were doing histories of their nations before nation state existed, folklore. And so that tradition, those people specifically, Dante Alighieri, these people, they set the foundation and the standard for a tradition that we hold today, that you're allowed to publish under your own name, not because of a First Amendment right to freedom. You have that First Amendment right to freedom because your work is the produce of your homeland. That makes a lot more sense when you're talking provincially, that your work is the work of your province. Your work is the work of a very small territory. After World War II, propaganda was looked at differently. So artists were no longer happy to only be allowed to write propaganda. They decided that what they were going to write was anti-propagandistic. And so after 1950, any work that seems propagandistic, any author who seems to be propagandizing a particular politic, a particular nation, a particular idea, they are going against the cultural grain, but they are going to be making an argument for cultural conservatism. These are real things. Jane Roberts in 1976, 1977, 1978, the 3 years that this book encompasses, is participating in a literary tradition which is at least 2,500 years old. And she isn't actually straying that far from what is orthodox. Orthodox in her time and orthodox through most of human history. She's allowed to say what she's saying. She's just fucking wrong. And that's what I object to. Or perhaps this also represents, well, she's wrong to do it in the voice of William James. So she's actually contributing. She's actually I'm sorry to do this so many times. I'm sorry to do it again so soon without even finishing that sentence. I'm going to lose where I was on that paragraph. I'm sorry to do this again. The Gospels were written in the way that Jane Roberts is claiming to have written this book. So the Gospel of Luke is not written by a person named Luke, and it's not written by any disciple who named Luke or who was named Luke and knew one of the disciples in life, knew Jesus in life. It's a riddle. It's a mystery. And so Jane thinks she's participating in that by writing in the perspective and in the name of a dead person, pseudonymously is what that's called. But Luke wasn't trying to say, well, what Jesus said isn't what Jesus meant. Or perhaps this also represents a kind of creative synthesis with which we're usually unfamiliar, a psychological reorientation that allows the medium to tune in to a different perceptive environment, which is then interpreted in terms that we do understand. Again, so I told myself. I wondered if the theater productions of the actor's world stand for an objective reality, then what is behind the seance's creative drama? Is the medium's experience a symbolic role-playing, I asked, that tries to depict through personification a definite alteration of consciousness that does in fact occur after death? And these are not questions that a dead man is asking. These are not questions that a dead man was asking before he died. These are the questions that Jane Roberts is asking as she's writing. She told you that she doesn't, or she told you that she's able to think and ask questions of her writing as she's writing because she lied to you, because she needs you to not be thinking about how she's literally asking questions of the prose as she composes it. She's literally improvising this. When I show up in my work, when I see myself in Rob, I'm always surprised, and for years I have been editing it out. Like, I'm not allowed to be in this. Yes, the medium's experience is a symbolic role-playing. When that woman in that documentary I watched was pretending to be that little dead little boy, the ghost of that little boy, and she's talking like this and she sounds like a little kid. Yeah, she's just doing a voice, people. Man, you would be spooked. I was bothered by how many women in their 50s were taken with it. It wasn't even a good little kid voice. I must profess, Jane Roberts continues as William James, that those seances I attended in life were far from quality artistic productions. However, and those performances that came under the guise of art, such as automatic writing, gave little evidence of creative merit. And of course, she would call creative writing, or she would call automatic writing art. Of course, she would have William James call what William James is doing or what she's doing in William James' name art. This decade, 1970, is when the fixation on art v science, well, it's an art, not a science, became a thing. I found primitive art charming, but such primitive gropings with the written word embarrassed me to the core. At least such was my own reaction to those manuscripts that came to my attention. And here, Jane is being honest. She's just telling us the truth. She read the automatic writing of people like Aleister Crowley and the seances of the 19th and early 20th century, and she said, this is appallingly bad. I could fake this so much better. And she has given her very best effort, and you have to give her at least those kudos. At least those kudos that she has given her best effort. My dad always said that nobody could ever say that you at least didn't give your best effort if you give your best effort, no matter how bad it is. If it's a 0.01 on a scale of 10, at least you gave your best effort. And she is giving her best effort. So good on her for that. There were also, however, more cultivated ladies from sheltered environments who held their seances in the tasteful parlors of the well-to-do, amid rich wall hangings with maids serving tea and cakes. Okay, so this one is the first one that I put her feminism in the description, and I talked about her being the feminist Edgar Cayce last time, and now I'm talking about why it's so important that we know that she's a feminist. Why the fuck is William James writing about so many women? Why is he writing about the perspective of women? William James wouldn't have been stupid enough to write from the perspective of women. He wasn't a woman. And anyway, women didn't get perspective from men in the early 20th century. Women weren't getting perspective from men in the 70s. This is not 2020. There were not male feminists running around, and William James most certainly wasn't one of them. I love how I keep getting I love that I keep getting visitors right walk in right as I say the really good crazy shit. Like that's I'm proud of that. I'm good with that actually. I'm bothered that this one is it's going to have so many technical issues in it, but I like that. We need to talk about why it matters. So I'm going to read it again. There were also, however, more cultivated ladies from sheltered environments who held their seances in the tasteful parlors of the well-to-do among rich wall hangings with maids serving tea and cakes. That's also not irrelevant because we are talking about an elite clientele, and we're probably talking about elite personages, elite, high class bullshit. This was not available to people like me, probably like you. Poor people, in other words. Parlors visited by quite educated men of letters. You could not be an educated man of letters and not be independently wealthy. And so what it means is that what Jane doesn't want you to know is that these seances were also sex clubs. There was illicit sex happening. She might actually tell you as we move forward because Jane has some serious damage. Some very real damage. I don't know what it is, but part of what we're doing is psychoanalyzing to see if we can pinpoint what that damage is. What does she obsess about? What does she talk about too much? And one of the things she's talking about too much is seances. She's just dwelling on it for way too long to be believable that she's not personally obsessed. William James doesn't seem to have been. We'll visit more of his work. Maybe I can find an actual essay that he wrote about seances because this was big business in the 1800s. Madame Blavatsky made a lot of money on speaking tours. You have no idea how much money she made. You can't appreciate. You have no ability to appreciate how much money people like me used to make. Um, Plato, Plato, for example. I think somebody said that he made 5,000 drachma a day, 2,500 drachma a day, maybe. A drachma was the amount of money that a common laborer made for a day's labor. A drachma was what you needed in order to eat and have a room for one day. He made 2,500 of those a day. That is staggering riches. That's not wealth. That's staggering riches. Plato himself had the ability to feed 2,499 people, not himself, every single day. Feed and house every day, and kept it. Think about that. Kept it. It became his, and he kept it and had no children. Think about that. Where did that money go? What did he spend all that money on? Do you want to know the answer? There's only one answer. Do you want to know it? Sex. Prostitutes. He was laughed at because he spent his free time with women. He spent his time and his money elevating women from poverty. Jesus, Jesus the Christ, and his disciples, Paul and his disciples, the poor of Jerusalem, the first and second century Christians, as they practiced their lives, spent their time and their money elevating people out of sex slavery, not just slavery, sex slavery. And do you know where you practice sex slavery? In the temple cult. That's real. All that money that was changing hands in the temple that Jesus was so mad about was sex slaves. Think about that. And Jane wants to bring it back. Jane Roberts is trying to bring it back. Andrea Perrin is trying to bring it back. Here, William James continues, the setting was more proper. The rapport between medium and investigator far more comfortable. Current news and gossip might be discussed before the events were drawn, but in their anxiousness is not a word. Everyone always says anxiety. In their anxiety. She wouldn't say anxiety because she was probably diagnosed with crippling anxiety. Their anxiousness to prove their cases, such ladies were produced only a more stately version of events. I read that wrong. Such ladies often produced only a more stately version of events with which the investigators were already familiar. A more cultivated package, perhaps, but with no more content. These more respectable ladies regulated their own emotional tones, perhaps automatically in response to the investigators' distrust of sentiment, trying to be even more reasonable, more logical, so that the results of their intuitive experiments would be favorably received. This was a pity, for such attempts worked counter to whatever abilities the ladies possessed. If you just if you just take that paragraph and forget that we're talking about seances and we're talking about spiritism and we're talking about magic and we're talking about religion, and you just forget all of that and you just ask yourself, is she talking about a brothel? She's talking about a fucking brothel. Paranormal events, however, had been labeled in such a way, often by psychologists themselves, that the incidents of them carried the tinge of unrespectability at best, and at the worst implied the most dangerous kinds of hysteria. Hysteria is a magic word and a key word here that we need to dwell on. Hysteria. And this chapter is going to be done, and I'm going to be done for this 2-hour period. Thank you for listening. Up this point, I'll do my goodbyes in a moment. Hysteria is a word that we need to lean on. We need to focus on, and that I should highlight in the book so that I see it later when I pick this book up, because hysteria and lunacy are different things. Lunacy is general insanity. Lunacy is bipolar in general. It's cyclical madness. It's people who are normal except for on the full moon, effectively. Hysteria is just called being a woman. So when she says hysteria, last time I talked about how feminists want to get all up in arms and they want to say things like the doctors who were masturbating hysterical women were doing it out of a sort of perverted pleasure when in fact the doctors hated it and wrote about hating it, wrote newspaper articles about hating it, and invented the vibrator so that women would do it for their damn selves because nobody likes jerking off your dog. If you like jerking off your dog, have fun. But nobody needs to be involved. And so when she says hysteria here, she's coding herself as feminist and as having a particular agenda, a particular bias, a particular worldview, and broadly wrong. Mary Wollstonecraft and Simone de Beauvoir were wrong about this issue. They weren't wrong about all issues, but they were wrong about this one. They were also wrong about prostitution. Paranormal events, however, had been labeled in such a way, often by psychologists themselves, that the incidents of them carried the tinge of unrespectability at best, and at the worst, implied the most dangerous kinds of hysteria. Experiments by psychologists in hypnosis deepened those connections by producing, though suggesting, acting upon hypnotist and subject alike, those results that were expected. And here's the thing: the scandal of psychologists sexually abusing their hypnotized partners, their hypnotized clientele, that's the 60s and the 70s. That didn't happen with Mesmer. So-called split personalities were psychologically manufactured by such dallyings, tailored to fit the hypnotist's preconceptions. A good hypnotist automatically hypnotizes himself before he begins to work his suggestions upon the mind of another, a fact not in the least understood then or now. And he did write a lot about mesmerism, but this is all dumb bullshit. You can't hypnotize yourself. Don't You can absolutely hypnotize yourself, but absolutely do not put yourself into an auto suggestible state. The first rule of being a wizard, and I mean a person who seeks and deals in wisdom. The first rule of being a practical magician is to understand that you are not God and that you do not get to make commandments of yourself. Do not hypnotize yourself. Do not suggest yourself. Do not auto hit. Don't do it. That's dumb. That's dumb cult bullshit from the 70s. She's just telling you every cult fad is good in William James' voice because everything William James said about that stuff was that it was bad and not to do it and to be practical and pragmatic and smarter than that. Now, did the true scientist dare allow himself to experience paranormal events? General speaking, for to do so would put him into the same kettle. This is not true either. It was only until the 70s that, it was only in the 70s because of the psychedelic movement of the 60s that scientists, public scientists especially, were expected to separate themselves from this behavior. This behavior before that was always expected of scientists. Bringing into question those qualities of objectivity, intellectual discrimination, and emotional balance that he believed separated him from those he studied. The more such a man tried to dismiss his emotions to retain an objective stance, the more his emotional needs strained at the academic leash, and the more he became fascinated by the emotional elements under investigation, the greater his risk of losing his psychic virginity. Okay, so wait a minute. I was being glib. I'm done reading her for a while. I'm going to do my goodbyes, and then I'm going to get something hot to eat, and then I'm going to pray that I make enough money to cover for that something hot that I have eaten tomorrow. We talked yesterday about circa 2005 politics where I was being kind of funny, and I said that it might have actually been in number one, not even in number two, but I said that your mind doesn't have antibodies. You do not have natural antibodies. She called it psychic antibodies. You do not have psychic or spiritual antibodies. You do not have in your body, females, a mechanism that will flush out unwanted semen, sperm cells. That's not real. It's not real in the material sense, and it's not real in the everything's real if you just think about it hard enough and long enough sense. It's not real. It's never been real. It's never been possible. And so what she's telling you, put this down because I was pissed off, but now I want to read that last sentence again. What she was telling you, the greater his risk of losing his psychic virginity is something only a woman can say. Only a woman can write that. Only a woman can think it, because only a woman is that pathological about maintaining her virginity. Men are not pathological about maintaining our virginities. Men are pathological about getting rid of that shit. Men don't even think in terms of whether they're a virgin unless they're a wizard. But women are valued for their virginity. So this psychic virginity is sick. It's pathological. Jane Roberts is unwell, was unwell. I think she's dead. I quit reading because I hate it. She's wrong. And I didn't know how to be sympathetic. Not empathetic. I could empathize. We ended on this last time. I could empathize with her if I wanted to, but I can't sympathize because she's sick. I don't know if I'm supposed to be staring at you the whole time. Looking at that light hurts my eyes, so I'm not going to do that. She's sick. She's unwell. Maybe next time we'll sit and we'll do her biography. I'm going to get something to eat. Thank you for spending 2 hours with me. I know we're only getting about an hour with Jane Roberts, and I'm promising you in the title that this whole thing is Jane Roberts. But that's my move. That's my style. I rarely talk about what I'm talking about. That's from the Shaggy Dog Philosopher. And I think it works. I think this works because it gives us a broader foundation rather than just hearing her words and, well, thinking, is that true? Is that not true? We can look at the other literature that we've visited, and then we can plan to look at other literature in the future to say, well, is Shaggy full of shit when he says nobody agrees with this stuff, or nobody says that, or she's making that up? Because there's a certain amount of pathological terror that I just don't actually know what the fuck I'm talking about here. And that's good. That's a good thing. Dunning-Kruger tells us that's a good thing, and that I'm trustworthy for that reason. And I'm saying, do I trust me? So thank you for being here. Thank you for being this far. Thank you for sticking around this long. Thank you for tolerating my technical difficulties when I was pretty sure my mic had cut out on me. Thank you for everything that you do. Find it in your heart to subscribe here. Find it in your heart to subscribe to the Patreon. Find it in your heart to visit me on Twitter. Maybe someday I'll start a secret society / cult, and you'll get the invite if you followed me soon enough, early enough. And please, if you find it in your heart, I do accept tips on Cash App. $1, 50 cents, whatever. This is a public performance, and in whatever way I am busking a huge number of skill sets. If anything I've done here has impressed you, you've liked any of it, Jen, thank you. Just let me know. Let me know what I can do better. There's a lot of it that I'm going to refuse to do better because I'm just not your dad's podcast. And that's okay. I love you. I think you're great. Have a great day. I'll talk to you probably again tonight because I'm actually feeling alert and good about myself because I ate before I did this. So I need a closing tag. Stay awesome. Nah, here's a good closing tag. Eyes up, eyes open, hands up. All right? Stay good, puppies.